He walked into the courtroom in handcuffs, alone against the entire system. The judge chuckled. The public remained silent. But once the boy spoke, everyone was shocked. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The morning broke quietly, without drama, without warning, as if the world had not yet decided whether it would offer mercy or cruelty. Jaden woke before his alarm, as he often did, lying still in the dim light of his small bedroom, listening to the creaks of the old house settle around him. Outside the single window, the sky was bruised with the fading traces of night, and the hush of the early hour wrapped everything in an uneasy calm. The room was barely large enough to hold the narrow bed, an old desk, and a tower of computer parts and tools stacked in meticulous disorder. On the wall, a faded poster of Alan Turing hung above his desk, a relic Jaden had found online, printed in black and white, and pinned up with care. Below it, his laptop rested atop an old textbook, closed but humming faintly, running processes that never slept. The screen's glow was muted behind the shell, a sleeping brain waiting to be summoned. He got up silently, careful not to wake his mother. The hallway floor groaned beneath his weight as he padded toward the kitchen. The apartment smelled of the lavender air freshener his mother overused, a desperate attempt to mask the mildew and faint traces of chemical cleaners from the night before. She had just returned from her shift at the care center, he knew, and was likely dead asleep. He found her curled up on the couch, one shoe off, the other hanging from her foot, uniform wrinkled, head tilted back at an angle that would surely leave her neck aching. He covered her gently with the frayed throw blanket, then returned to the kitchen. Breakfast was perfunctory. He never ate much before school, but he packed 2 protein bars and a bottle of water into his bag just in case. The laptop, his prized possession, was already tucked into the padded sleeve he'd modified himself. Inside was everything: his projects, notes, source code, and above all, the beginnings of a self-learning AI he'd been developing since he was 12. He called it Raven, Recursive Adaptive Virtual Engine for Neural Inquiry. It was still rudimentary in some ways, but it could already parse unstructured data, draw patterns, and run limited simulations. It had no interface. It didn't need one. It listened, watched, and responded to his voice like a friend. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, he slipped on his hoodie and adjusted the backpack's weight on his shoulder. The air was crisp, laced with exhaust fumes and the faint metallic scent of rain to come. The neighborhood was coming alive slowly. Mothers herding sleepy children toward bus stops, men in steel-toe boots heading to early shifts, the drone of a lawnmower starting somewhere in the distance. He walked fast, as he always did. There was something in him that couldn't go slow, a kind of tension, a sense that he was behind even when he was ahead. He passed the graffiti-scarred wall near the liquor store, the abandoned gas station, the convenience store that never closed. He nodded to Mrs. Jenkins, who sold tamales from her front porch. She gave him a warm smile, the kind of smile that didn't cost anything but still felt like a gift. The high school loomed at the end of the street, all concrete and faded paint, a building that looked tired long before the day even started. The security guards stood at the gate like statues, scanning every student like a threat. Jaden passed through the metal detector, greeted by its familiar beep, and headed to his locker without a word. Classes passed in a blur. He was there physically, but his mind floated above the fluorescent lights and peeling bulletin boards. In AP Physics, he finished the test in 10 minutes and spent the remaining 20 sketching neural pathways on the back of the paper. In Computer Science, He tried to ignore the teacher's poorly veiled irritation when he corrected him about data serialization. In English, he tuned out the group presentation about Lord of the Flies and wondered, not for the first time, how many hours remained before he could get back to his code. The call came during the third period, a soft knock at the classroom door, a whisper between teacher and administrator, then the words, "Jaden Walker, you need to come with us." There was no urgency in the voice, but the silence that followed was unnatural. Heads turned. Eyes followed him as he packed his bag. He could feel their curiosity pricking at his back like 100 tiny needles. He'd never been called out of class before, never been in trouble. He walked out slowly, heart ticking faster but outwardly calm. The assistant principal led him down the hallway, past the library and the trophy cases, past the posters urging students to believe in themselves, to dream big, to report suspicious activity. At the end of the corridor was the administrative office, and inside, 2 uniformed police officers were waiting. They were both white. One older, with a drooping mustache and the heavy-set build of someone who'd spent years behind a desk. The other was younger, leaner, eyes sharp like razors, fingers tapping idly against his holstered weapon. Between them sat the principal, his hands clasped, expression carefully neutral. Jaden's instincts kicked in instantly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't about a truancy or a disciplinary matter. This was serious. "We have some questions for you," the older officer said. "We need you to come with us." Jaden asked why. They didn't answer. He asked again. This time, the principal glanced away, pretending to shuffle papers. The officers stood. The younger one stepped forward. "Backpack, please." Jaden hesitated. Then, slowly, he slipped it off and handed it over. The officer unzipped it, pulled out the laptop. "Is this yours?" "Yes," Jaden said. "Where'd you get it?" "I built it." That earned him a look. Not surprise, not curiosity, something colder, something skeptical. They snapped the bag shut and turned toward the door. "We'll need you to come with us downtown." They didn't read him his rights. They didn't tell him what the charges were. They didn't handcuff him until they were in the hallway, in full view of the students pouring into the corridor for lunch. It was fast, efficient, practiced. A voice shouted. A phone camera flashed. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else gasped. Jaden walked between the officers, wrists bound, head high. He didn't resist, didn't cry, didn't ask any more questions. The ride to the station was silent. The officers spoke only once, to call in a code he didn't understand. He sat in the back of the squad car, hands on his knees, trying to keep his breathing even. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. He was trying to understand, trying to analyze. At the precinct, they took his fingerprints, took his photograph, took his phone, even though it was off. The questions came next. "Do you know what a felony is, son? Have you ever accessed unauthorized databases? Did you design this program for personal use or for sale? Who helped you?" He told them the truth, over and over again. No, he didn't hack anything. No, he didn't sell his code. No, he wasn't working with anyone. He had built Raven for school, for learning, for himself. They didn't listen. They repeated questions, changed the order, tried to twist his words. A detective with tired eyes and coffee-stained teeth leaned in close and called him smartass. Told him he was too clever for his own good. Said, "You people always think you're above the rules." They held him in a cell that night, small, cold, empty except for a bench and a flickering light. He sat with his back to the wall, legs crossed, staring at nothing. He thought about his mother, who still didn't know. He thought about Raven and whether the system had already been dismantled. He thought about the servers he had explored out of curiosity, not malice. Public ports left open, unsecured folders, databases without firewalls. None of it was criminal. At least, it wasn't supposed to be. In the morning, they brought him into a room with a lawyer he didn't know, a public defender who looked bored and underpaid. "They're offering a deal," the man said, not even making eye contact. "Plead guilty, 6 months in juvie, record sealed when you turn 18. Jaden stared at him. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said. The lawyer shrugged. "Doesn't matter. They've got enough to make it stick." He folded his hands in his lap, calm, still. "I want to represent myself." The lawyer blinked. "Kid, that's not how this works." But it was, and it would. That night, in his cell, Jaden watched the camera in the corner of the ceiling and whispered into the silence, "Are you still running?" A flicker of light on the wall, a tiny pulse. Raven was listening, and Jaden was ready to fight. Jaden sat on the edge of the metal bench, the thin gray cushion beneath him flattened by years of use, barely concealing the chill of the steel underneath. The walls of the holding cell were painted a dull, institutional white, scuffed and marked by time and the quiet rage of those who had passed through before him. The air was stale, humming with the faint electric buzz of overhead lighting. Hours bled into each other in the sterile timelessness of the precinct until day and night became irrelevant. There was only before the arrest, and now. He had slept in fits, if at all, stretched on the bench with one arm over his face, his mind looping through everything that had happened. He'd replayed each moment with obsessive precision. The classroom, the hallway, the officers, the silence in the car, the questions, the cell. Something wasn't adding up. It was too fast, too coordinated. It felt less like a response and more like a setup. When they came for him in the morning, he didn't flinch. 2 officers, new faces, one tall, blank-eyed, the other younger, already jaded. They said nothing as they led him down the narrow corridor, through a metal door, into a plain room with white cinder-block walls and a table bolted to the floor. A single chair on either side. Waiting for him was the same public defender from yesterday, still wearing the same suit, only more wrinkled now with a styrofoam cup of coffee balanced in his hand. "Walker," the man said, not unkindly, but with the exhausted indifference of someone who had long stopped believing anything mattered. "Sit down." Jaden sat. "They're filing formal charges," the man said. "Criminal access of a protected network, tampering with municipal infrastructure, possession of tools for unlawful digital activity." Jaden blinked. "What tools?" "Your laptop, the code, the AI you wrote. That's research. It's an academic prototype. It's not even finished." The lawyer gave a sigh and rubbed his eyes. "They don't care. They've got a judge lined up, they've got their experts lined up, and they're going to make it look like you were building something dangerous, something weaponized." "It's a simulation engine," Jaden said evenly. "It analyzes patterns in data sets. It doesn't even have a remote execution protocol. It's not capable of acting independently." The lawyer held up a hand. "I'm just telling you what they're going to say. Look, the DA is offering a plea deal. 6 months in juvenile detention, suspended sentence. Your record gets sealed at 18. You'll be out before summer's over. You take this now, and it's done." Jaden studied the man's face. He wasn't lying. He wasn't even trying to manipulate. He simply didn't care. This was just another number, another folder on the desk. Jaden realized then that this man didn't believe in innocence or guilt, only in damage control. "No," Jaden said. The lawyer froze, coffee halfway to his lips. What? I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. Kid, you really want to roll the dice with a jury? With a judge who already thinks you're a threat? I'll represent myself. The lawyer laughed. What are you, a TV lawyer now? This isn't some courtroom drama. You can't just walk in there and out-talk a judge. Jaden's voice was quiet but firm. Watch me. They brought him back to the cell. He sat again on the bench, folded his arms, and closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, his mind was moving at full speed. The charges were more than exaggerated. They were calculated. They were positioning him not as a misguided teen, but as a digital saboteur. They wanted fear, not justice. And that meant the real danger wasn't what he had done. It was who he was. The detention center was a different kind of cold. Not just physical, though the concrete walls and thin blankets ensured that. It was institutional, impersonal, as if the very architecture had been designed to remove identity. The intake process was clinical. Stripped of his clothes, given a uniform several sizes too large, assigned a number, handed a mattress rolled in plastic. The guards didn't speak unless necessary. The other boys, ranging from sullen to hardened, gave him curious glances, but said little. Jaden kept to himself. He observed. He remembered everything. The codes on the doors, the way the guards rotated shifts, the blind spots in the camera system, the routine. Each piece mattered. Every fragment was a thread he could pull. On his third day, they allowed him access to the facility library for constructive time. It was a small room with a few dozen books, half of them torn or water-damaged, and a single computer station behind a plexiglass shield. He requested law books. They were reluctant at first, then shrugged. No one thought it would make a difference. He read and read. Civil procedure, criminal law, constitutional precedent, the limits of juvenile court jurisdiction. He absorbed the language of the system with the same hunger he had once brought to coding languages and algorithms. He took notes on every loophole, every irregularity. He began mapping out a legal strategy, not just for defense, but for offense. If they wanted a trial, they would get one. But it would not go the way they expected. The next week, they brought him to the courtroom for arraignment. His mother was there, sitting in the back, eyes rimmed red, hands clenched around the strap of her purse. She looked smaller than he remembered, as if the burden of everything had shrunk her. He met her gaze and nodded once. Her lips trembled, but she did not cry. The judge, a pale man in his late 60s with thinning white hair and a permanent frown etched into his face, leaned back in his chair as if already bored. The courtroom was mostly empty, save for the court clerk, a bailiff, the prosecutor, a woman in her 50s with a sharp jaw and a sharper stare, and the court reporter. Jaden rose to speak. I'd like to waive public counsel and represent myself. There was a pause, a visible ripple of surprise. The judge raised an eyebrow. Are you certain? Yes, Your Honor. You understand the charges against you? I do, and I believe the evidence will demonstrate my innocence. The judge made a show of glancing through the paperwork. This is not a school debate club, Mr. Walker. These are serious allegations. I understand that. The judge sighed. Very well, but you will still be supervised by advisory counsel, court appointed. You may consult with him, but you're responsible for your own defense. Jaden nodded. The prosecutor rose. Her voice was cold and clipped. Your Honor, the defendant has been found in possession of highly sophisticated programming code which was actively interfacing with municipal data systems. The state will show that this was an intentional and unauthorized act of intrusion, posing a threat to public security. Jaden took a breath. I intend to demonstrate that no such threat existed, that the systems in question were publicly accessible, unprotected, and that no damage or disruption occurred. Furthermore, I will present evidence that the charges are based on flawed assumptions and reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of the technology involved. The judge narrowed his eyes. Are you implying the prosecution does not understand the evidence? I'm stating that I do. There was a beat of silence. The arraignment continued mechanical and perfunctory. A preliminary hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Jaden was remanded to the detention facility until then. Outside the courtroom, his mother met him as the guards escorted him through the hallway. She reached out, touched his arm briefly. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. He nodded. "They don't expect me to fight." She looked at him, tears brimming. "Just be careful, please." "I will." Back in his cell, he lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, mentally rehearsing every line, every citation. He would not go down quietly. They thought he was just another kid who got too curious. They thought they could intimidate him, shame him, erase him. But they had underestimated one crucial thing. Jaden Walker wasn't trying to survive. He was preparing to dismantle the machine from inside. In the stillness of the detention center's night, when the hallway lights dimmed and the corridors fell into uneasy quiet, Jaden found his thoughts growing sharper. The absence of noise, of movement, of color, everything around him reduced to grays and flickering fluorescence, only served to heighten the clarity of what was unfolding. He wasn't just a defendant anymore. He wasn't merely trying to get back home. He had entered a different kind of territory now, one where his mind had to act faster than those who had long ago stopped questioning the authority they served. He kept his routine consistent. Wake at dawn. Eat the same bland food in the cafeteria under the watchful gaze of indifferent guards. Avoid conflict. Study in the library. Think at night. Every hour was accounted for, every decision deliberate. He had become a kind of algorithm himself, stripped of distractions, reduced to essential purpose. In the detention library, amid worn-out encyclopedias and old paperback novels, he had found the legal texts buried on a bottom shelf, spine-creased and annotated by dozens of bored hands before him. The pages were smudged with fingerprints, the corners dog-eared, but they were enough. He devoured them. Criminal statutes, juvenile procedures, evidentiary standards, landmark cases. He read case law like someone reading ancient code, disassembling logic, searching for vulnerabilities. But it wasn't enough to understand the law. He had to understand the system that enforced it. Jaden began mapping patterns, not just of the rules, but of behavior. He watched the guards, cataloged their routines, their biases, their moments of carelessness. He listened to other kids, their stories, their arrests. Almost all of them, like him, had been swept into the system for vague, inflated charges, petty theft, loitering, resisting arrest that often amounted to nothing more than asking a question. Their accounts blurred together into a single, brutal consistency. It was the same story, told through different faces. At night, Jaden returned to Raven. The AI had survived, tucked away in his encrypted cloud backup, untouched by the authorities because they hadn't known where to look. He accessed it cautiously from the library terminal, using lines of masked code that appeared to be nothing more than a text file. With it, he began building a larger profile, not of himself, but of the patterns behind his own case. Raven wasn't just his assistant now, It was his weapon. He fed it open court records, local crime data, prosecution histories, sentencing outcomes. The program began to surface correlations. Judges who ruled more harshly against black defendants, prosecutors who filed inflated charges, police departments with repeated misconduct cases. He followed the trail, one breadcrumb at a time. There was a judge named Hargrave, the one assigned to his case. Jaden discovered that Hargrave had presided over more than 200 juvenile cases in the past 5 years, and in nearly every one involving a black or Hispanic defendant, he had rejected motions to suppress evidence. In 76% of those cases, he had sided with the prosecution without question. Meanwhile, similar cases with white defendants saw dismissals or lenient outcomes more often than not. It wasn't an accusation yet, but it was a pattern, and patterns, Jaden knew, were everything. The prosecutor, Marion Delancey, had her own trail. Jaden's AI found that she often brought charges under statutes originally written for terrorism cases, even when the crimes were low-level digital infractions, script kiddie pranks, and accidental server pings. She had a reputation for coming down hard on tech-related crimes, even when the intent was harmless, especially when the accused was young and brown. Jaden documented everything. He printed charts and graphs from the library printer, folded them into books, stored them in a hollowed-out dictionary. He knew they'd search his cell eventually. He wasn't going to make it easy. In his rare free time, he thought of home, of his mother, who had visited only once since the arraignment. She had come into the visitation room wringing her hands, her eyes swollen with fatigue. Her voice was cracked when she whispered, "They said you were building something dangerous." Jaden had taken her hands and said, "They don't understand what I'm building." She hadn't responded. She just stared at him like she was trying to memorize his face. After she left, he sat at the steel table long after the guard told him time was up. He had no idea what was happening at school, whether anyone missed him, whether his teachers had bothered to check on him. But deep down, he suspected the silence meant more than indifference. It meant complicity. To them, he was already guilty. Another black boy who got too smart, too bold, too visible. It wasn't what he had done. It was that he dared to think for himself. By the time his next hearing approached, Jaden had prepared his first formal motion, a request for discovery. He filed it in person, standing before the judge, his voice steady. "I'm requesting full access to all technical logs from the municipal server in question, Your Honor, including firewall status, access timestamps, and port security reports." The judge looked mildly amused. "This is not a technical forum, Mr. Walker. With respect, Your Honor, the prosecution is alleging digital intrusion. If they want to assert that, they need to prove the system was secured. Otherwise, this is not a breach, it's a scapegoat." The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed the motion to stand. Jaden had earned the right to defend himself. Now he would use it. Back in the detention library, he began reviewing the initial evidence file the prosecution had reluctantly shared. Server logs printed out on reams of paper, full of IP addresses and timestamps. Jaden studied them like ancient manuscripts. Within minutes, he saw what he needed. The server his program had pinged had no active firewall protocol at the time of access. It was broadcasting openly on the public internet. No credentials required, no encryption. He flagged the line and smiled for the first time in days. That night, he couldn't sleep, not from fear, but from anticipation. The fear had hardened into resolve now, a cold fire beneath the surface. They were going to try and bury him in words and suits and institutional silence. But he had found his footing. And more importantly, he had found the cracks. In the cell beside him, a boy named Eric, a lanky 15-year-old with bruises on his knuckles and a haunted look in his eyes, asked what he was reading. "Cases," Jaden replied, "like for real?" "Yeah." Eric leaned closer, half whispering. "You think you're going to win?" Jaden looked up. "I'm not here to win. I'm here to expose." The boy said nothing, just stared at him for a long moment before lying back down. The guards grew colder toward Jaden as the days passed. They didn't like that he was asking questions. They didn't like that he was reading, citing, filing motions. He noticed one guard linger near the computer terminal longer than usual. Another began confiscating his notes more aggressively during cell checks, but he never kept anything crucial in one place. He'd already anticipated this. For every set of notes they took, he had 2 more hidden elsewhere. Raven, meanwhile, had started building something bigger. A statistical model of local juvenile justice outcomes. Race, age, type of charge, judge, sentence. And the results were damning. In the model's first projection, the probability of a black defendant receiving maximum sentencing was 3.8 times higher than that of a white defendant in a comparable case. And Jaden's name, his face, his circumstances, they fit the profile with mathematical precision. It was no longer just a defense. It was an indictment. In the middle of the night, he wrote the opening statement he would deliver at trial. He didn't memorize it. He didn't need to. Every word came from the same place, a lifetime of being seen as a problem just for being curious. They wanted him to be afraid. Instead, he was calculating. They wanted him to be silent. Instead, he was collecting voices, his and all the ones like his who hadn't been heard. He was no longer just defending himself. He was on the verge of making history. By the end of his 4th week in detention, Jaden had become an anomaly, not just to the guards but to the entire facility. Where most boys arrived with sullen stares and quick tempers, folding themselves into the bleak rhythm of confinement or rebelling against it with futile bursts of resistance, Jaden moved with quiet purpose. He kept to his routine, said little, broke no rules, but there was something about the way he carried himself, something that suggested he wasn't just enduring the system. He was studying it. The guards whispered about him now, not in front of him, never directly, but he heard them when they thought he wasn't listening. "The hacker kid," they said, "thinks he's smarter than the court." Some laughed, others didn't. A few began treating him differently, more brusque, more impatient. His presence agitated them in a way they couldn't name. He was respectful, never confrontational, yet he carried the air of someone who knew too much. In a place built to suppress, Jaden had become a disturbance without ever raising his voice. The library remained his sanctuary. He sat at the same terminal each day, under the indifferent gaze of a bored guard who played crossword puzzles on his phone. The computer was locked to a filtered network, but Jaden had already worked around its restrictions. Nothing malicious, nothing traceable, just enough access to public databases, legal archives, open-source files. From there, he fed Raven with everything he could find. Case histories, judicial records, internal audits, complaints against officers, sentencing disparities. Every data set was another layer in the unfolding architecture of a system that wasn't broken by accident. It was designed that way, and the patterns were everywhere. He traced the case assignments of Judge Hargrave, who was slated to preside over his trial. The judge's record once plotted across Raven's analytic grid, revealed a grim precision. In over 83% of juvenile cases involving minority defendants, he ruled in favor of prosecution-led evidence, even when defense had presented grounds for dismissal. He had presided over cases involving illegal searches, coerced confessions, and procedural violations, almost all upheld without scrutiny. His decisions had been appealed 37 times. None had been overturned. He was, statistically, one of the most prosecution-friendly judges in the state. And now he would decide Jaden's fate. Marion Delancey, the lead prosecutor, was another node in the network. Her office had filed charges in nearly every juvenile cyber case in the district, even those that experts later determined involved no criminal intent. She had pioneered a strategy of charging under enhanced security statutes originally meant for counterterrorism, converting minor digital infractions into felonies. The result? Longer sentences, harsher pleas, and almost no accountability for law enforcement overreach. Jaden compiled it all. He documented not just the data, but the stories behind the numbers. Kids who had been expelled, criminalized, silenced. Some had served time. Others had disappeared into the system, their names lost in sealed records and buried files. Jaden read everything he could find. He saw himself in each account, a pattern of curiosity mistaken for threat, of potential treated as danger. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it was meant to do, just not for the people it claimed to serve. His request for discovery had yielded more than he'd hoped. The logs from the municipal server, reluctantly submitted by the city's IT department, confirmed what he already knew. The server he had accessed had no firewall enabled at the time of contact. There was no encryption, no login required. It had been an open endpoint, left exposed by negligence. His program hadn't breached anything. It had merely connected to what was already broadcast into the world. But the state's report omitted those details. Instead, it labeled the connection as unauthorized intrusion and flagged his code as potentially malicious. He drafted his response meticulously, citing precedents, quoting cybersecurity experts, attaching screenshots from the logs. He included a technical appendix that explained in plain language what his program had done and, more importantly, what it had not done. The report was 15 pages long, with footnotes and cross-references. He filed it to the court clerk with a calm smile and a quiet thank you. Later that week, during his hour of outdoor time, he sat alone on a bench in the yard, watching the other boys circle each other in packs. Some fought, others joked. Most just killed time, pretending the fences didn't exist. A guard lingered nearby, arms crossed, sunglasses masking his expression. Jaden ignored him. He was thinking through his cross-examination strategy for the city's IT expert. Back inside, during dinner, a boy named Tomas slid onto the bench beside him. He was 16, wiry, with quick eyes and a mouth that never stopped moving. He had been watching Jaden since the day he arrived. "I heard you're making a case," Tomas said, voice low. Jaden didn't look up. "I'm defending myself." Tomas grinned. "Yeah, I know. Heard one of the guards say you're going to embarrass the whole damn court." Jaden said nothing. He had no interest in attention, but the whispers were spreading. Word had reached even the older boys, the ones who usually ignored new arrivals. Some scoffed. Others watched with quiet hope. "You think you'll win?" Tomas asked. Jaden finished his tray and stood. "I think I already have their attention." The next morning, the guards searched his cell. It wasn't a surprise. He had expected it ever since the IT logs had been submitted. They went through his bedding, His books, the hollowed-out dictionary, they found nothing. Jaden had already hidden his backup notes in the base of the library's broken printer, behind a loose panel he had discovered during his first week. That afternoon, during a supervised session in the conference room, Jaden met briefly with his court-appointed advisory counsel, a young attorney named Daniel Cho. Cho had been silent during the arraignment, more observer than advocate, but now he regarded Jaden with cautious respect. "You filed a motion to compel witness testimony," Cho said, flipping through a folder. "You're calling the city's IT director, a cybersecurity expert, and a former federal systems auditor." Jaden nodded. "Those are all ambitious choices. They're necessary." Cho tilted his head. "You know, I went to law school with people who couldn't write half the motions you filed." Jaden didn't answer. Cho leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're making them nervous. I don't know how this ends, but whatever you're doing, it's working." Jaden studied him. "Are you going to help me, or just watch?" Cho cracked a small smile. "Both." Back in his cell that evening, Jaden worked on his outline for trial. He wasn't just building a defense. He was constructing a mirror, one that would reflect the system back at itself. Every question he planned to ask would be precise, deliberate, calibrated to expose not just the weaknesses of the prosecution, but the structure that allowed such a case to exist in the first place. He imagined the courtroom, the judge's frown, the prosecutor's cold stare, the jury, if there was one, watching a 15-year-old boy dismantle the scaffolding of their assumptions. He wasn't naive. He knew the risks. Even the truth, when wrapped in the wrong skin, could be dismissed. But he wasn't going to apologize for knowing more than they expected him to. He wasn't going to shrink himself for their comfort. He wrote late into the night, his pen steady even when his body ached with fatigue. When he finished, he folded the pages carefully and placed them inside a manila envelope marked Supplemental Materials Defense. He slept better that night than he had in weeks. The system had drawn its lines. Jaden was drawing his own. The morning of the pretrial hearing arrived with gray skies and air heavy with moisture. Rain had fallen overnight, soaking the cracked pavement of the courthouse parking lot and leaving behind puddles that mirrored the looming facade of the building. Jaden stepped out of the transport van in ankle chains and handcuffs, flanked by two officers whose faces betrayed the same mix of boredom and mild irritation that had become routine in his transfers. He kept his head high and his steps steady. Each time he was led into this building, he reminded himself that they weren't parading a suspect, they were escorting a strategist. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was still and expectant. The same judge, Hargrave, sat behind the bench, shoulders hunched as if gravity pulled harder on him than others. He shuffled papers and sipped weak coffee, his expression fixed in a look of perpetual irritation. Marion Delancey, the prosecutor, sat to the left of the courtroom, her legal pad neat and untouched. Her sharp eyes flicked toward Jaden briefly, and then returned to her notes as if he were no more interesting than the clerk recording the proceedings. Jaden sat at the defense table, unaccompanied but not unprepared. Cho, his advisory counsel, sat in the gallery, notebook open but silent. He had learned not to interfere. When the judge called the hearing to order, the bailiff read aloud the charges once more. Jaden listened calmly. Each accusation, unauthorized access to a municipal server, interference with public infrastructure, unlawful possession of advanced cyber tools, sounded dramatic, theatrical. That was the point. The prosecution didn't want facts. They wanted headlines. Delancey rose first. Her voice was smooth and practiced. Your Honor, the state maintains that Mr. Walker intentionally developed a program capable of interfacing with and extracting data from protected government systems. While we acknowledge that the server in question may have had vulnerabilities, the defendant's access was not incidental. He built a system, deliberately and with intent, to identify those vulnerabilities and exploit them. Jaden waited. He didn't flinch. The state will present testimony from cybersecurity analysts who reviewed the defendant's code and determined its potential to compromise critical systems. We will also introduce evidence of similar behavioral patterns among known cyber offenders to establish a profile consistent with malicious digital conduct. She sat. The judge made a note with a slow stroke of his pen. Jaden rose, buttoning his oversized jacket. His posture was deliberate. He stood as someone who didn't need the courtroom's permission to be there. Your Honor, I intend to present evidence that the server was not protected, not encrypted, and not password restricted. In fact, I will demonstrate that the system was accessible to anyone with an internet connection. My program, Raven, was designed as a research tool. It does not possess autonomous action functions. It does not exploit or alter data. It analyzes publicly available inputs and identifies statistical anomalies. The judge frowned. Are you asserting that the server was public? Yes, Your Honor, and I have the connection logs to prove it. He handed over a thick document, meticulously printed and bound. The judge flipped through the first few pages, then passed it to the clerk. Jaden continued. Furthermore, I will be introducing expert testimony from a licensed cybersecurity consultant, Dr. Alan Namani, who will attest to the server's open configuration at the time of the alleged incident. His report is included in the appendix. There was a pause. Hargrave looked at Delancey. You've seen this report? I have, Your Honor, she said stiffly. Do you dispute its authenticity? We reserve the right to cross-examine Dr. Namani's methodology. The judge nodded. Then we'll hear it at trial. Jaden moved forward. He could feel the energy shift in the room, not dramatically, but perceptibly. There was a new tension. For the first time, the weight wasn't entirely on his shoulders. It was beginning to shift. I also intend to call Officer Raymond Hill, one of the arresting officers, he said. On what grounds? The judge asked. Jaden didn't hesitate. His report contains factual inconsistencies. During the arrest, Officer Hill stated that the device in question was actively breaching a secure city database. However, this statement is contradicted by the server logs, which show no evidence of intrusion, modification, or data extraction. Furthermore, Officer Hill claimed in the report that the laptop was running a live hack script, a term that has no basis in recognized cybersecurity terminology. Delancey objected, but the judge waved her down. I'll allow the testimony. Jaden sat down. The silence that followed was louder than any gavel. The rest of the hearing passed in procedural motions. The prosecution requested a restriction on media access. Jaden didn't object. He didn't need publicity yet. Not here. Not now. His time would come. Afterward, in the holding room behind the courtroom, Cho approached. You've got them off balance. Jaden leaned back in the hard plastic chair. Not enough. Not yet. Cho offered a faint smile. You're playing chess. They're playing checkers. Just don't get cocky. I'm not, Jaden said. I'm calculating. Later that evening, back in detention, he resumed work. The printer in the library still hid his primary cache of notes. He retrieved a small notebook wrapped in brown paper and brought it back to his cell. There, under cover of darkness, He opened it to a fresh page and wrote out a list. It wasn't a to-do list. It was a witness list, not for his own defense, but for what came after. He began collecting names. Kids like him. Cases closed without defense testimony, cases dismissed with records sealed, erasing the evidence of misconduct, cases where evidence mysteriously disappeared, or where plea deals had been forced under pressure. He drafted a statistical abstract modeled on the one Raven had generated earlier. Then he began turning the abstract into a presentation, one he would use not in court, but in the court of public opinion. When the time was right, it would be published, circulated, cited. Raven ran silently, buried in the file system of a public domain archive site, accessed only by a coded string and a proxy server. The AI continued to evolve, analyzing media reports, social sentiment, court records. It was beginning to learn not just data, but context, intent, bias. Jaden no longer thought in terms of his case alone. He was already past that. The system had tried to erase him. He was going to become the mirror it couldn't escape. 3 days later, Cho returned with a warning. "They're changing tactics," he said. Delancey filed a motion to introduce a behavioral profile. "They're trying to paint you as a budding extremist, radicalized through technology. No priors, but unusual isolation, advanced technical skill, unmonitored online behavior. All the usual buzzwords." Jaden expected this. When the facts failed, they'd reach for fear. If they couldn't discredit his code, they'd try to discredit his character. "They're setting up a narrative," Cho added, "that you're not just a threat, you're unpredictable, dangerous." Jaden folded his arms. "Then I'll give them something they don't expect." The following week, in preparation for the trial, he filed his most ambitious motion yet. A motion to present comparative sentencing data across juvenile cases in the district. Attached was a 50-page report compiled by Raven, comparing outcomes for black and white defendants charged with cyber-related crimes over a 7-year span. The numbers were irrefutable. Jaden didn't include commentary. He let the data speak. He submitted it with a note. Exhibit for contextual analysis of prosecutorial patterns. Delancey filed a rebuttal within 24 hours. She called it irrelevant, inflammatory, not pertinent to the case at hand. The judge hadn't ruled yet, but the silence was cracking. Jaden returned to his cell that night and sat for a long time in the darkness. He no longer dreamed of escape. He dreamed of confrontation, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in clarity. He wanted the truth to be inescapable. He wanted those who hid behind the law to feel the weight of its real purpose, and he was getting close. He could feel the machine beginning to slow, just slightly, just enough to show that it could bleed. He wasn't finished, but he was getting close. The courthouse was fuller than usual. It began subtly, a trickle of unfamiliar faces in the gallery, people who weren't family members or local officials or board interns from nearby law schools. These were strangers with notebooks, badges clipped to their collars, quiet expressions, and sharp eyes. Reporters, bloggers, activists. They didn't belong to the local machinery that ran the courts like a factory line. They were from the outside, and they had come because someone had whispered about a boy who was defending himself against a system that wanted to pretend he didn't matter. Jaden felt the change the moment he stepped into the courtroom that morning. The air was different, more alert, more charged. Even the bailiff's posture was stiffer. Judge Hargrave was already seated, scanning the bench with his usual sour disapproval, but he too seemed less at ease. Delancey sat at the prosecution table with her back straight and her jaw tighter than usual. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it. Jaden walked to the defense table with his wrists chained loosely at the front, his orange jumpsuit replaced for the day with a simple dark gray blazer and shirt slightly too big at the shoulders. He had insisted on it, arguing that presenting a minor in prison garb would bias the jury, should it come to trial. Hargrave had allowed it, reluctantly, after a long pause that made it clear he'd wanted to say no. The pre-trial hearing that day was procedural on paper, reviewing motions, finalizing witness lists, and setting expectations for the official trial. But Jaden had filed a new request just 2 days prior, and the judge had yet to address it. A motion to enter comparative sentencing data into the record, accompanied by a detailed statistical report analyzing racial disparities in local juvenile justice outcomes. It was an audacious move, one Cho had warned him could backfire if the judge ruled it inflammatory or irrelevant. But Jaden wasn't aiming for a win in the traditional sense anymore. He was aiming for exposure. When the judge finally acknowledged the motion, he did so with visible discomfort. Mr. Walker, you have submitted a document entitled Exhibit for Contextual Analysis of Prosecutorial Patterns, spanning approximately 50 pages, not including appendices. This includes charts, statistics, and summaries of sentencing data collected from what source precisely? Jaden stood. His voice was calm, direct. Public court records from the district's juvenile docket, cross-referenced with available sentencing outcomes from the last 7 years. The data was analyzed through a program I designed, using standard statistical modeling protocols. Delancey rose immediately. Your Honor, we object in the strongest possible terms. This is not a criminal trial about sentencing patterns or societal inequities. This is a case concerning a specific individual accused of a specific crime. To allow this kind of extraneous commentary would undermine the impartiality of the court. Jaden remained composed. Respectfully, Your Honor, the prosecution has already attempted to frame my case not just around the facts, but around my perceived intent, my supposed behavior patterns, and my background. They've introduced the idea that I represent a kind of threat profile. If they want to argue context, then so do I. This data doesn't speak to politics. It speaks to pattern. And patterns matter. Hargrave stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. I will review the exhibit in full before making a determination. Until then, it will be held under consideration. Jaden nodded once and sat. Outside the courtroom, people had begun to gather. A small group had appeared that morning, holding signs not of protest but of presence. Due process for all. Let the data speak. Smart doesn't mean guilty. Someone had posted Jaden's opening statement from the last hearing online, and it had spread. Not virally, not yet, but enough to reach communities hungry for something to rally behind. Enough to catch the attention of local newspapers and campus organizers. Enough to make the system look up, if only briefly. Later that afternoon, as Jaden sat in the visitation room behind reinforced glass, Cho appeared again, carrying a messenger bag and looking slightly more rumpled than usual. I just came from a round table at Easton University, he said, settling into the seat opposite. Some professors from the law department are following your case. One of them even used your motion as a case study in class this morning. Jaden blinked. Seriously? Seriously. You've got people paying attention now. They're not ready to say anything publicly, not yet, but they're watching. Jaden processed the information in silence. Then, almost absently, he asked, Have they said anything about the judge?" Cho smiled faintly. Off the record, someone called him a pre-digital dinosaur. But no one's accusing him of bias. Not yet. Jaden leaned forward slightly. They will. He had spent the last 2 nights rebuilding his presentation outline. It was no longer just about clearing his name. It was about drawing the line from his case outward, to the dozens like his, to the trends hiding in silence. Raven had compiled case after case where black boys were charged as adults for nonviolent offenses, where bail was denied without cause, where plea deals were offered with veiled threats. Jaden wasn't guessing anymore. He had proof. And it wasn't just statistical. It was human. The detention center felt different now, too. The guards were more cautious, watching him with the kind of wary attention reserved for things that didn't fit. He noticed their pauses before speaking to him, the new reluctance in their eyes. Jaden had become a variable they didn't know how to handle. Even among the other detainees, the shift was apparent. Some still mocked him, called him Professor or Judge Walker with a smirk, but others had started asking questions. Tomas stopped him in the yard to ask how court was going, then quietly slipped him a folded note. His own case summary, written in shaky block letters with the words, "Can you check this?" scrawled at the bottom. Jaden didn't promise anything, but he took the note. Back in his cell, under the thin light of the overhead bulb, he added it to a growing pile. Names, details, case numbers. He was building something larger than a defense. He was building a library. The next day, a local journalist published a short article under the title, "15-Year-Old Prodigy Takes on the Court." It quoted portions of Jaden's filings, described him as poised and preternaturally articulate, and included an offhand remark from a university professor. If this young man had been born into different circumstances, we'd be reading about him in tech journals instead of legal briefs. Jaden read the article during library hours and felt nothing like pride. He didn't want to be exceptional. He wanted to be understood. Still, the article worked. More reporters arrived. A podcast featured a segment about youth in the system. Someone began tweeting quotes from his filings under the hashtag #LetJadenSpeak. A writer from a major online publication requested an interview, which Cho declined for now. The exposure was good, but premature. Jaden wanted the first real impression to come from his own voice. In court. Meanwhile, the prosecution filed a flurry of motions to restrict further filings from the defense, citing unsubstantiated sociopolitical theory and irrelevant statistical noise. It was desperation masquerading as order. Hargrave delayed his ruling on Jaden's exhibit again. Then, finally, came the email that changed everything. Cho brought it in on a Tuesday afternoon. The hearing that morning had been brief but tense, with the judge admonishing both sides to prepare for a focused trial. Jaden had returned to detention drained, but still calculating. Cho found him in the library. "It's from the Department of Public Advocacy," Cho said, sliding the printout across the table. "They're opening an internal inquiry into prosecutorial misconduct based on your data. They're not naming names yet, but your report is now officially part of the review." Jaden stared at the page. It wasn't vindication, it wasn't victory, but it was momentum. That night, he sat in his bunk, legs crossed, pen in hand, eyes scanning a new list of questions he had drafted for cross-examination. This time, they weren't just for the IT director or Officer Hill. They were for the prosecution. They were for the judge. They were for everyone who had thought he would sit quietly and let the system crush him. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. The court had heard his voice. the world was starting to listen. By the time the trial officially began, the courthouse had transformed into something more than a legal institution. It had become a stage. The front steps were no longer bare in the morning. Now they were occupied by quiet lines of onlookers, some local, some not, holding signs without shouting, sitting without chanting, but unmistakably present. The air buzzed with a strange electricity, not of protest but of anticipation. Journalists leaned against brick walls with notepads, cameras shifted on shoulders, voices murmured into microphones. They had come for the story of the boy genius in chains. But what they found was something different. A courtroom starting to flinch under the weight of its own performance. Jaden entered through the side entrance, flanked by officers, dressed again in his gray jacket and pressed slacks. His face was calm, unreadable. His eyes slightly narrowed in that same expression of constant calculation. His wrists were no longer cuffed. The judge had relented after a brief motion by Cho citing bias in perception. Small victories. Inside, the courtroom was standing room only. A row of legal interns perched behind the bar. Several professors from Easton's law department sat in quiet clusters. The gallery included students, journalists, former defendants, quiet families who had once watched their sons be swallowed by this same system and now returned, not for revenge, but for reckoning. Jaden stood when the judge entered, then sat without looking left or right. Marion Delancey shuffled her papers with crisp, efficient movements. Her expression gave away nothing, but Jaden noticed her jaw. It was set too tight. She was bracing. Judge Hargrave cleared his throat, eyes flicking down to the docket. Proceedings will commence. State versus Jaden Elijah Walker, docket number 81,472, B. Both sides ready. Delancey rose. Prosecution ready. Jaden stood slowly. Defense is ready, Your Honor. The first day was devoted to opening arguments and the first round of witnesses for the prosecution. Delancey began with the narrative she'd been building for weeks. A precocious but reckless youth, unusually skilled with computers, who had chosen to use his talents to invade and compromise protected digital infrastructure. She described Raven in abstract terms, implying that it could have done great damage had it not been discovered in time. She alluded to potential security threats, the fragility of modern systems, the dangers of unchecked digital autonomy. She was careful not to lie, but she leaned heavily into inference and fear. Jaden watched her the way a doctor watches symptoms. Then it was his turn. He rose and walked to the center of the courtroom, not to the podium but a few steps past it, turning slightly to face both the judge and the gallery. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. I did not break into a secure system, he began. I did not steal, damage, or alter any government data. I created a program to study how systems behave, how they fail, how they adapt, how they reveal what they weren't designed to hide. And that system, the one I built Raven to observe, isn't digital. It's this one, the one we're all sitting in right now. A murmur stirred in the gallery. The judge didn't admonish them. He simply nodded. Proceed. The next several hours were consumed with testimony. Delancey's expert witness, a cybersecurity analyst from a private firm, testified that Raven had the potential to perform unauthorized actions. Jaden cross-examined him carefully, methodically, dismantling the foundation of his analysis. Can you confirm, Jaden asked, that your review was based on a partial copy of the program retrieved by law enforcement during the arrest? Yes. And that this version was isolated, incomplete, and lacked its contextual framework and control parameters? That is correct. Did you test the program in a live environment? No. So your conclusions are based not on what Raven did, but on what you imagined it might do, under hypothetical conditions not present in the incident? The witness hesitated. Yes, that's fair. Jaden turned to the judge. No further questions. The momentum shifted, slowly, subtly, like a tide changing under the surface. The next day, Jaden called Officer Raymond Hill. The officer, mid-40s, thick around the middle with a clipped tone and short answers, recited the events of the arrest with mechanical certainty. Jaden let him speak. Then, when it was his turn, he opened a folder and pulled out a copy of the officer's report. You wrote here that the device, my laptop, was actively engaged in breaching a city database at the time of the arrest. Yes. Were you able to verify that at the time? We had probable cause. That wasn't my question. Did you personally verify that the laptop was breaching a protected system before detaining me? No. Who told you it was breaching? It was relayed through dispatch from tech services. Tech services that had not yet examined the device. I followed procedure. Jaden paused. Are you familiar with the term-live hack script? It's a general term. Is it recognized by the Department of Justice as standard terminology? Hill looked confused. I don't know. Jaden held up a printout. I contacted 3 federal cybersecurity offices. None of them used that term. In fact, none of them could define it. So, I'll ask again. Did you fabricate this language to make your report sound more serious? Delancey objected, but the judge allowed the question. Hill bristled. I used the language I had. Because it sounded incriminating? Hill didn't answer. Jaden lowered the paper. No further questions. Each day of the trial deepened the divide between what the state alleged and what the evidence showed. When Jaden called Dr. Namani, the cybersecurity expert who had reviewed the server's configuration, the testimony was unequivocal. There was no firewall, no password, no encryption. This was an open port, publicly visible. Anyone could have accessed it by accident. Jaden asked, would accessing that system be comparable to opening a public website? Yes. Technically, that's an accurate analogy. And would that constitute unauthorized access under federal or state law? Not if no credentials were bypassed or permissions elevated. No. Jaden nodded. Thank you. Delancey tried to recover, calling a second analyst, but the damage was done. Her questions rang hollow. Her confidence thinned. Then Jaden submitted the comparative sentencing report. The judge tried to dismiss it. But the gallery was full now. The article had gone national. A senator had tweeted about the case. A major nonprofit had offered legal support. There were cameras in the hallway and microphones waiting at the foot of the stairs. Hargrave begrudgingly allowed a summary to be read into the record. Jaden stood and read it himself. In this district, over the past 7 years, black juvenile defendants accused of digital offenses received maximum sentencing 3.8 times more often than white counterparts. In over 60% of cases involving white defendants, charges were dropped, diverted, or pled down without detention. In contrast, black defendants were overwhelmingly processed through formal adjudication. He folded the paper. The law is supposed to be blind, but the data sees what we don't want to admit. By the time closing arguments arrived, Delancey's voice had lost its edge. She still spoke of responsibility, of rules, of structure, but it sounded performative now, like an actor delivering lines from a play the audience had already stopped believing. Jaden stood once more. He spoke without notes. Systems protect themselves. That's what they're built to do. And when something doesn't fit, when it doesn't look the way they expect, speak the way they expect, think the way they expect, they try to explain it away, or punish it, or erase it. He paused. I didn't come here to ask for mercy. I came to show you the code behind the curtain. To show you what happens when we stop pretending this is about justice and admit it's about control. He looked at the jury. I trust you'll do what the system couldn't. It took them 3 hours. The verdict was read on a Thursday morning. On all counts, not guilty. The courtroom didn't erupt. It inhaled. It exhaled, and then it shifted. Hargrave dismissed the case without ceremony. Delancey packed her papers in silence. Cho sat motionless, eyes forward, a small flicker of something that might have been relief crossing his face. Jaden turned. In the back of the room, his mother stood. No tears, no expression, just a single, quiet nod. He nodded back, and just like that, it was over. Not the fight, but the silence. That, at last, had been broken. The morning after the verdict, the sun rose without ceremony. A cool breeze moved through the streets of the city, nudging aside old newspapers and lifting the edges of window signs that had curled from age and neglect. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered for the trial had vanished. The cameras were gone. The microphones had been boxed up and carted away. There were no more flashes, no more reporters waiting by the steps. The spectacle was over. But Jaden Walker was still there. He stood alone at the bottom of the courthouse stairs, hands in the pockets of his gray coat, his posture upright but still. He looked not at the building behind him, but at the street ahead, the uneven sidewalks, the flickering street lamps, the shuttered stores he had passed so many times before. His mother stood a few steps behind him, arms crossed, her purse slung over her shoulder the way it always was. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. There was nothing left to explain. They rode home together in silence. Not the kind of silence that suffocates, but the kind that speaks of exhaustion, of reflection, of the heavy knowledge that something has ended and something else is about to begin. His mother kept her eyes on the road. Jaden kept his eyes on the world outside the window. Neither of them asked what would come next. Their apartment looked exactly as he had left it. The pile of old textbooks on his desk, the tools in their trays, the sheets half folded on his bed. The only difference was the layer of dust on the windowsill and the plastic bag of unopened mail on the kitchen table. He moved through the space quietly, taking stock not just of the objects but of the life that had been paused. He touched nothing. He sat down at his desk, closed his eyes, and let the quiet return. But it didn't last long. The first message came that afternoon. A brief email from an administrator at Easton University. An invitation to speak at a symposium on juvenile justice and digital ethics. A panel of professors wanted to hear his story. No grades, no tests, no applications. Just his voice. He didn't answer. The second came from a tech company. An offer for mentorship, internship, relocation if necessary. A list of benefits, compensation, access to labs and tools he could never afford on his own. He didn't answer that either. Over the next 3 days, the offers kept coming. Universities, non-profits, media requests, fellowships, scholarships, book deals, invitations to speak at conferences, to appear on television, to become the face of something. The headlines still circled. Teen hacker acquitted. Boy genius walks free. System versus mind. But Jaden didn't open the articles. He had already lived the story. What no one seemed to understand was that the moment they thought was his victory wasn't the end of his fight. It was the beginning of his clarity. The system hadn't just tried to erase him. It had revealed itself to him, not just its cruelty, but its machinery, its language, its vulnerabilities. He had seen how it moved. He had learned its rhythm. And now he was free not because they had let him go, but because he no longer needed to ask for permission. It was on the fourth night after his release that he found himself back in the library. Not the cold, utilitarian one in detention, but the old public library 2 blocks from his school, the one with chipped wooden tables and mismatched chairs, where the internet was slow and the shelves still smelled faintly of glue and paper. He sat at his usual spot, tucked in the back corner behind the reference section, and pulled out a notebook from his coat pocket. He flipped past the trial notes, past the court documents, past the technical diagrams. He turned to a blank page and wrote a title. Sentinel. It wouldn't be like Raven. Raven had been the beginning. A tool to learn, to watch, to record. But Sentinel would act. It would be open source, decentralized, impossible to shut down. It would scan public court records in real time, flagging anomalies in juvenile cases. It would cross-reference arrest data with sentencing outcomes, monitor for patterns of discrimination, and compile reports that anyone could read. Judges, lawyers, journalists, teachers, families. It wouldn't predict crimes. It would expose injustice. And it wouldn't belong to him. It would belong to all the kids like him, and all the kids who had come before him, who hadn't had a Raven, who hadn't been lucky enough to be heard, who had vanished into a system that never intended to see them. He worked until the library closed, then walked home in the dark, his mind still building. In the weeks that followed, the attention began to fade, as it always does. The reporters moved on to new stories. The internet lost interest. The stream of invitations slowed, but Jaden didn't. He declined every offer. He turned down Easton. He turned down the tech company. He ignored the television producers and the speaking circuits. He sent polite emails to each of them, thanking them for their interest, explaining that he wasn't ready to talk. Some understood. Most didn't. He used the small donation fund someone had set up during the trial to register a nonprofit. It had no office, no staff, no funding beyond what people volunteered, but it had a name, Third Rail. It would do what no one else had done for him. It would find the patterns and make them visible. It would train young people, not just in code, but in systems. Not to fight back, but to look closer, to ask questions, to build tools that could see further than laws were willing to. Tomas was the first to join him. He showed up at Jaden's door one morning with his case file in hand, eyes wide and unsure. "You said you'd check this," he muttered. Jaden let him in. Then came 2 more boys from the detention center, then a girl from a school across town. Kids who had heard. Kids who were curious. Kids who had questions no one had ever taken seriously. Jaden didn't make speeches. He didn't teach classes. He gave them tools, showed them how to find what was hidden, how to ask the right questions, how to see the difference between the rules on paper and the rules in practice. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a seed. A month after his release, Jaden received a letter. Not an email, but an actual letter, typed on heavy paper and sealed with a crest he didn't recognize. It was from a judge. Not Hargrave. A younger one. A woman in another district who had read the summary of his trial and had questions about his report. She wrote, "If your analysis is correct, then we've been sentencing in the dark. I'd like to see the light." Jaden folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer. The next morning, he went back to the library. He had work to do. It would take years, maybe decades, but he was ready. Not because the court had found him innocent, but because he had built something stronger than a defense. He had built a way forward. If you found this story meaningful, consider subscribing for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. And if this spoke to you, share it.